The words hung in the air like a blade waiting to fall. "If you can conduct this entire interview in fluent Arabic," Sheikha Layla Al-Rashid said, her perfectly manicured fingers drumming against the mahogany desk, "then perhaps you might be worthy of working for the Al-Rashid Group." Her voice carried the casual cruelty of someone who had never been denied anything, never been told no, never watched a dream slip through desperate fingers. She leaned back in her leather chair, a predator toying with prey, certain she was about to watch another American applicant crumble under the weight of their own inadequacy. What she didn't know was that the man sitting across from her, the one in the wrinkled shirt and scuffed shoes, the one who had taken 3 buses to get here because his car wouldn't start, was about to shatter every assumption she had ever made about who deserved power in this world. The 42nd floor of the Al-Rashid Tower pierced the Philadelphia skyline, like a golden spear thrust toward heaven. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a commanding view of the Delaware River, where container ships moved like toys in a billionaire's bathtub. The office itself was a monument to wealth that whispered rather than shouted Persian rugs worth more than most people's homes. A desk carved from a single piece of Lebanese cedar, and walls lined with photographs of Sheikha Layla shaking hands with presidents, prime ministers, and kings. At 28, Sheikha Layla Al-Rashid commanded a business empire that stretched from Dubai to Detroit, from oil refineries in the Gulf to tech startups in Silicon Valley. Her hijab was Hermes silk, her abaya hand-tailored in Milan, her presence so commanding that grown men who controlled billions of dollars found themselves straightening their ties when she entered a room. She had inherited her father's company at 22 and tripled its value in 6 years, earning her a reputation as both brilliant and ruthless. But today, something was different. Today, the quarterly reports spread across her desk told a story she didn't want to read. The American expansion was hemorrhaging money, 3 failed acquisitions, 2 botched partnerships, and a cultural divide so deep it was swallowing millions of dollars monthly. Her board of directors, all men old enough to be her grandfather, were beginning to whisper about inexperience, about the dangers of putting a young woman in charge, about the wisdom of their late father's decision. "We need someone who understands both worlds," her chief advisor had told her that morning. "Someone who can bridge the gap between our culture and theirs." The words tasted bitter in her mouth. She had spent her entire life proving she needed no bridges, no compromises, no accommodations to anyone else's limitations. Which was why, when Human Resources had sent up the file for Marcus Thompson, she had nearly thrown it in the trash. Another American consultant, promising to solve problems he couldn't possibly understand. Another outsider who thought a few months of online language courses qualified him to navigate the complexities of Arab business culture. She had agreed to the interview only to make a point to demonstrate, once and for all, why the Al-Rashid Group's American operations required leadership that understood the true depth of their heritage. The elevator chimed softly, and Marcus Thompson stepped into her world. Sheikha Layla's first impression was disappointment wrapped in professional politeness. He was exactly what she had expected, mid-30s, brown hair slightly mussed from the October wind, wearing a suit that had seen better years. His shirt was pressed but fraying at the cuffs, his shoes polished but worn, his briefcase, the kind you bought at an outlet store when you couldn't afford leather. Everything about him screamed desperation, over-eager firmness of someone trying too hard to make a good impression. His voice carried the flat, unremarkable accent of someone who had never lived anywhere but America, never struggled with the music of a second language, never understood that words could carry the weight of centuries. She shook his hand briefly, noting the calluses that suggested manual labor, the slight tremor that betrayed nerves, the way his eyes darted to the luxury surrounding him before quickly looking away. "Sheikha Al-Rashid," she corrected coolly. The title matters. Of course. My apologies. Sheikha Al-Rashid. She gestured to the chair across from her desk. As he sat, she opened his file with theatrical deliberation. Each page turn designed to increase his discomfort. Bachelor's degree from Temple University, respectable but not impressive. Previous experience in logistics and supply chain management, useful but hardly innovative. No mention of international experience, no foreign language skills, no indication he had ever set foot outside Pennsylvania. Mr. Thompson, she began, her voice carrying the polite disdain of someone about to deliver an inevitable verdict. Your resume is adequate for certain positions, but the role of Cultural Integration Director requires a unique skill set. This person will be the primary liaison between our Dubai headquarters and our American operations. They will need to navigate not just business differences, but cultural nuances that take years to understand. Marcus nodded earnestly. I understand the challenges, Sheikha Al-Rashid. I've done extensive research on Middle Eastern business practices, and I'm confident. Research. She cut him off with a smile that could freeze fire. How fascinating. Tell me, Mr. Thompson, in your extensive research, did you happen to learn any Arabic? If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. The question hung between them like a test with only one acceptable answer. Marcus felt his palms grow damp against the armrests of his chair. This was the moment he had been dreading, the inevitable stumbling block that would end the interview before it truly began. He had known it was coming, had rehearsed a dozen different responses during the 3-hour bus ride that morning, each one sounding more pathetic than the last. The truth was a luxury he couldn't afford. Not with Amira's tuition due next week. Not with the overdue rent notice taped to his apartment door. Not with the electricity bill that had already earned him one warning and would earn him disconnection if he didn't pay it soon. He needed this job with a desperation that made his chest tight and his breathing shallow. He said carefully, the word emerging smaller than he had intended. Basic conversational phrases. Business terms. Sheikha Layla's smile widened, and somehow this made it more dangerous. Basic conversational phrases. How wonderful. She leaned forward, her elbows on the desk, her fingers steepled in front of her face, like a judge about to deliver sentence. Here's what I'm going to do, Mr. Thompson. I'm going to give you an opportunity that no other candidate will receive. A chance to prove that you're different from every other American who walks through that door thinking good intentions can substitute for real understanding. Marcus felt his stomach drop. Whatever was coming, he knew he wasn't prepared for it. If you can conduct this entire interview in fluent Arabic, she continued, each word pronounced with surgical precision, then, perhaps you might be worthy of working for the Al-Rashid Group. If you can demonstrate real linguistic competence, cultural awareness, and the kind of sophisticated communication skills this position demands, then we can discuss compensation that would reflect such rare abilities. She paused, watching his face carefully, studying every micro-expression, like a scientist observing a specimen under a microscope. However, if this interview reveals that your basic conversational phrases are as inadequate as I suspect, then I want you to understand something clearly. You will never work for any company in our network. Not in Philadelphia, not in New York, not anywhere our influence reaches, because I will not tolerate mediocrity disguised as competence. The threat was delivered with the casual efficiency of someone used to wielding power like a scalpel. Marcus could feel the weight of it settling around his shoulders like a lead blanket. The Al-Rashid Group's influence in the mid-Atlantic business community was legendary. One word from Sheikha Layla could close doors he didn't even know existed. "Do you accept these terms?" she asked, her voice soft as silk and twice as dangerous. Marcus stared at her across the expanse of cedar and power, his mind racing, through calculations that had nothing to do with business and everything to do with survival. Amira's school had already called twice about late tuition payments. His landlord had made it clear that sympathy had limits, and eviction notices didn't. The temp agency that provided his current work had assignments that lasted days, not months. And certainly not long enough to solve problems that required thousands of dollars. But there was something else in that moment, something that cut deeper than financial desperation. It was the way Sheikha Layla was looking at him, not just with expectation of failure, but with a kind of cold amusement, as if watching him struggle was entertainment, as if his desperation was somehow proof of her superiority. He thought of Amira that morning, 8 years old and brilliant, sitting at their tiny kitchen table, working on homework that was already more advanced than anything he had studied at her age. "Daddy?" she had asked, looking up from her math workbook. "Why do you work so many jobs? But we still don't have enough money." He had given her the same answer he always gave. "Because sometimes things are hard before they get better, sweetheart. But they will get better." Now, sitting in this palace of marble and ambition, Marcus realized he had reached the moment where that promise would either prove true or reveal itself. As the lie, desperate parents tell their children, "I accept," he said quietly. Sheikha Layla's smile was triumphant. She had been conducting interviews like this for 3 years, ever since taking control of the American expansion. Americans who claimed cultural sensitivity but couldn't pronounce shukran correctly. Consultants who spoke about bridge building while demonstrating they had never bothered to learn the first thing about the culture they claimed to respect. Each failure had confirmed what she already knew. Real understanding couldn't be faked, borrowed, or learned from a textbook. "Excellent!" She folded her hands and switched to Arabic, her voice taking on the musical quality that came naturally when she spoke her father's language. "Let us begin properly then. Tell me about yourself, Mr. Thompson. What brings you to seek employment with our company?" The words hung in the air between them. Marcus felt the familiar sensation of standing at the edge of a cliff, knowing that the next step would either carry him to safety or send him plummeting into an abyss from which there would be no return. For a moment that stretched into eternity, he said nothing. The silence filled the space between them, like water rising in a locked room, threatening to drown them both in the weight of expectation and the certainty of failure. Sheikha Layla waited, her expression patient but predatory. She had played this scene before. Now came the stammering, the half-formed words in broken pronunciation. The inevitable moment, when another American revealed the poverty of their preparation. She was already composing the email she would send to HR, already thinking about the next candidate who would undoubtedly prove equally inadequate. But Marcus wasn't thinking about failure anymore. He was thinking about Amira's laugh when he read her Arabic poetry before bed, about the way her eyes lit up when he explained the etymology of words that connected across cultures and centuries. He was thinking about Professor Khalil at Penn, who had looked at his master's thesis 15 years ago and said, "You don't just speak Arabic, Marcus. You think in it." He was thinking about the truth he had been hiding for 8 years, buried under the weight of circumstances and necessity, and the terrible mathematics of survival that had forced him to choose between dreams and reality. Marcus Thompson looked directly into Sheikha Layla Al-Rashid's eyes, drew a breath that seemed to come from the deepest part of his soul, and began to speak. But not in the broken, hesitant phrases she expected. Not in the careful textbook pronunciation of someone who had learned from apps and audio courses. Instead, His voice carried the fluid confidence of someone who had spent years not just studying Arabic, but living inside it, breathing it, dreaming in its rhythms and poetry. And he didn't speak in just one dialect. "Your Excellency," he began in the formal classical Arabic reserved for diplomacy and literature. His pronunciation crisp and precise, each syllable weighted with respect and authority. "I come before you today, not as someone seeking merely employment, but as someone who understands that true partnership between our worlds requires more than good intentions." Sheikha Layla's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, her eyes sharpening with the first flutter of surprise. Marcus continued, seamlessly shifting to the Gulf dialect of the UAE and Qatar, the language of oil executives and international finance. "I have spent the last 8 years working in positions far below my quote, training and education. Not because of inability, but because circumstances demanded I prioritize my daughter's immediate needs over my own professional aspirations." Her fingers, which had been drumming confidently on the desk moments before, went still. "But during these years," Marcus said, now switching to the Levantine dialect of Syria and Lebanon, his accent perfect, his cultural references precise, "I have never stopped studying, never stopped learning, never stopped preparing for the day when I could contribute meaningfully to the kind of cross-cultural collaboration that your company represents." The silence that followed wasn't the heavy quiet of impending failure. It was something else entirely. The electric stillness that comes when the world shifts on its axis, and everyone in the room realizes that nothing will ever be quite the same again. Sheikha Layla Al-Rashid, who had been prepared for many things, sat frozen behind her cedar desk, staring at the man in the wrinkled shirt who had just shattered every assumption she had made about American competence, about linguistic ability, about the vast distance between her world and his. And Marcus Thompson, who had spent 8 years invisible in his own life, finally allowed himself to be seen. The real interview, he realized, was just beginning. The silence stretched between them like a bridge neither had expected to cross. Sheikha Layla's perfectly composed facade had developed its first crack. A barely perceptible tightening around her eyes, the way her manicured fingers had gone completely still against the cedar desk. In 28 years of life and 6 years of absolute corporate control, she had rarely encountered anything that could surprise her. Marcus Thompson, in his discount suit and worn shoes, had just accomplished the impossible. She said finally, her voice carefully neutral, though something deeper flickered behind the command curiosity wrestling with disbelief. Marcus felt the shift in the room's atmosphere like a change in air pressure before a storm. The predatory confidence that had radiated from Sheikha Layla moments before hadn't disappeared, but it had transformed into something more complex, more attentive. For the first time since entering this palace of marble and power, he sensed he might actually have a chance. But he also knew this was the most dangerous moment of all. He had revealed his hand, shattered her expectations. But now came the harder test, proving that his linguistic ability was more than performance, that it represented genuine understanding of the cultural depths she was protecting so fiercely. Marcus shifted in his chair, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a different quality. Not the desperate eagerness of a man begging for work, but the measured confidence of someone who understood exactly what was at stake. "Your Excellency," he continued in the Najdi dialect of Saudi Arabia's royal family, his pronunciation, azan, and antet, carrying the subtle formality reserved for palace courtrooms and high-level diplomatic functions. "Permit me to explain, not just what I can offer your company, but why the current approach to American expansion has encountered such significant obstacles." Sheikha Layla's eyebrows rose almost imperceptibly. The Najdi dialect was notoriously difficult for foreigners to master. Its rhythms and inflections, shaped by centuries of Bedouin poetry and tribal negotiation. More than that, it was the language of power in the Gulf, the dialect that separated insiders from outsiders, those who truly belonged from those who merely visited. "Please," she said, and for the first time, the word carried genuine invitation rather than challenge. Marcus leaned forward slightly, his voice taking on the cadence of someone who had spent years thinking deeply about these exact problems. The fundamental issue isn't financial or strategic, it's philosophical. Your American partners approach business, relationships as transactions, inputs, outputs, metrics, and quarterly reports. But in Arab culture, business is about family, honor, trust, built over generations. When your American executives sit in meetings discussing deliverables and performance indicators, your Arab partners hear the language of distrust, of relationships reduced to numbers. He paused, switching seamlessly to the Egyptian dialect that served as the Arabic world's common tongue, his voice carrying the warmth and accessibility that made this dialect the language of diplomacy across the Middle East. I have spent 8 years working in positions where I could observe American business culture from the ground up. Warehouse floors, delivery routes, customer service centers. I have seen how we communicate, how we build relationships, how we express respect and trust. And I have seen where those patterns create invisible barriers with partners who think differently about what business relationships should mean. Sheikha Layla found herself leaning forward, drawn in despite herself. This wasn't the superficial cultural sensitivity training that American consultants usually offered generic advice about avoiding pork and alcohol, remembering prayer times, shaking hands appropriately. This was something deeper, more nuanced. Born from genuine understanding rather than Google searches and Wikipedia articles. "Give me an example," she said, switching to Arabic herself, her voice carrying the crisp authority of someone testing the limits of his knowledge. Marcus nodded, his expression serious. 3 months ago, your company terminated the partnership with Midwest Distribution after they failed to meet delivery targets for the Chicago market. The American narrative was simple: they couldn't perform, so you moved to a more competent vendor. But I reviewed the public statements and financial reports. The real breakdown wasn't operational, it was cultural. He shifted to the Moroccan dialect, its French influences and Berber undertones, marking it as one of the most challenging variants of Arabic for outsiders to master. Your executive team, following standard American practice, implemented weekly performance reviews and daily check-ins. In your culture, this represented diligent oversight, ensuring quality and accountability. But to American business culture, constant monitoring signals distrust. The message your partners received was, "We don't believe you can do this job properly without constant supervision." Sheikha Layla's expression had shifted entirely. The predatory amusement was gone, replaced by the focused attention she reserved for board meetings and strategic planning sessions. "You believe they sabotaged their own performance?" "Not consciously," Marcus replied, returning to classical Arabic, his tone measured and analytical. "But when people feel mistrusted, they begin to act in ways that confirm those suspicions." The American team started providing minimum effort, meeting only the explicit requirements while abandoning the kind of innovative problem-solving that creates true partnership. Your team, seeing this decline, increased oversight, which further damaged trust. The spiral was inevitable. Marcus could see recognition dawning in Sheikha Layla's eyes, the uncomfortable realization that he was describing patterns she had witnessed but never fully understood. The string of failed American partnerships suddenly looked less like American incompetence and more like systematic cultural miscommunication. "What would you have done differently?" she asked, her voice carrying genuine curiosity rather than challenge. Marcus smiled for the first time since entering the office, and the expression transformed his entire face. Gone was the desperate anxiety of a man grasping for survival, replaced by the quiet confidence of someone discussing a subject he understood better than almost anyone alive. "I would have started by reframing the understand relationship entirely," he said, switching to the Iraqi dialect, its Persian influences and Mesopotamian rhythms marking it as one of the most historically rich variants of Arabic. "Instead of performance monitoring, I would have implemented cultural bridge sessions, monthly meetings, where both sides could discuss not just metrics, but methods. Why certain approaches work in different contexts. How to adapt strategies without compromising core values." He leaned back slightly. "Well, Antonio Instures," his voice taking on the storytelling cadence that was central to Arab communication traditions. In Arab culture, business relationships begin with understanding the person, the family, the history that shapes decision-making. American business culture starts with understanding the transaction, the immediate problem, the fastest path to results. Neither approach is wrong, but they're fundamentally incompatible unless someone builds a bridge. Sheikha Layla was quiet for a long moment, her sharp mind processing implications that went far beyond this single interview. If Marcus was right, if the American expansion failures were rooted in cultural miscommunication rather than American incompetence, then everything about her approach needed to change. "You said you've been working below your education level," she said finally, her voice softer than it had been all morning. "What is your actual background?" For the first time since the interview began, Marcus hesitated. This was the moment where truth could either save him or destroy him completely. But he had come too far to retreat into comfortable lies. "Master's degree in Middle Eastern Studies from the University of Pennsylvania," he said quietly, returning to English for the first time since the interview had truly begun. "Specialized focus on linguistic anthropology and cross-cultural business communication. I spent 4 years in Jordan and Syria before the Civil War, working with NGOs on community development projects that required navigating between Western funding sources and local tribal leadership structures." Sheikha Layla blinked, the revelation hitting her like cold water. "You have a master's degree in Middle Eastern Studies, fluency in 7 Arabic dialects, and 4 years of field experience in the region, and you're currently working?" "Night security at a warehouse in South Philadelphia," Marcus said, his voice steady, but his eyes carrying the weight of 8 years' worth of compromise and sacrifice. 3 nights a week. I also drive for a delivery service on weekends and work part-time at a customer service call center when they need additional staff." The silence that followed was different from the earlier tension. This wasn't the quiet of impending judgment, but something more complex, the pause that comes when someone's entire understanding of a situation shifts fundamentally. "Why?" Sheikha Layla asked, and the single word carried more weight than any of the elaborate tests she had planned. Marcus looked out the floor-to-ceiling windows at Philadelphia, spreading below them, the city where he had built a life from the wreckage of dreams he thought he had lost forever. When he spoke, his voice was quiet but absolutely steady. "My daughter Amira was born 3 months after I finished my master's thesis. Her mother, Sarah, was diagnosed with early-onset Alzheimer's when Amira was 6 months old. The progression was rapid, devastating. By the time Amira turned 2, Sarah needed full-time care." He paused, his hands folded in his lap, his gaze still focused on the world outside the window. "I had job offers. Good ones. The State Department wanted me for their Cultural Affairs Division. 2 different consulting firms offered positions that would have used my regional experience, but they all required travel. long hours, the kind of schedule that doesn't accommodate caring for a wife who was disappearing a little more each day, and a toddler who needed stability more than anything else. Sheikha Layla found herself holding her breath, drawn into a story she hadn't expected to hear. Sarah died when Amira was 4, Marcus continued, his voice carrying the quiet strength of someone who had learned to speak about unbearable things. The medical bills, even with insurance, were catastrophic. I had to choose between pursuing the career I had trained for and ensuring my daughter had a stable home, food, and educational opportunities. He turned back to face her directly, and she saw something in his eyes that made her chest tighten. Not self-pity, not resentment, but a kind of clear-eyed determination that she recognized from her own mirror. "I chose Amira," he said simply. "I chose jobs with flexible schedules, benefits that covered pediatric care, and hours that let me be present for school events and bedtime stories, and the 1,000 small moments that become childhood. I chose invisible work that paid the bills and allowed me to be the parent she needed." Marcus leaned forward slightly, his voice taking on a new intensity. "But I never stopped studying. Every night after Amira went to sleep, I read academic journals, followed regional developments, maintained correspondence with colleagues still working in the field. I kept my skills sharp because I always believed that someday, somehow, I would find a way to use them again." "And you believe that day is today?" Sheikha Layla asked, her voice carrying none of the earlier challenge, only genuine curiosity. "I believe," Marcus said, returning to classical Arabic, his voice carrying the weight of years of deferred dreams and carefully maintained hope, "that your company needs someone who understands both worlds, not just intellectually, but personally. Someone who has lived the American struggle for economic survival while maintaining deep respect for Arab culture and values. Someone who can speak to American workers about dignity and family honor, and to Arab executives about the pressures that drive American business decisions." He switched to the Yemeni dialect, its ancient rhythms carrying echoes of frankincense roots and mountain kingdoms. "Most importantly, your company needs someone who has learned that true strength doesn't come from power over others, but from the willingness to build bridges that serve everyone involved." Her mind racing through implications and possibilities she hadn't considered when she planned this interview. Everything about Marcus Thompson contradicted her expectations, not just his linguistic abilities, but the depth of his experience, the complexity of his motivations, the way he had transformed personal sacrifice into professional insight. "Tell me about your daughter," she said suddenly, the request emerging from instinct rather than interview strategy. Marcus's entire expression changed. Tension replaced by warmth, professional composure giving way to pure parental love. "Amira is 8 years old, brilliant, curious about everything, and absolutely fearless in the way that only children can be. She speaks 3 languages, English, Arabic, and Spanish she picked up from our neighbor, Mrs. Rodriguez. She wants to be either a veterinarian, an astronaut, or a diplomat, depending on what day you ask her." He smiled, and the expression lit up his entire face. "She's the reason I work 3 jobs. The reason I studied Arabic poetry instead of watching television. The reason I never gave up believing that excellence would eventually be recognized. Everything I've done for the past 8 years has been for her." "Does she know about your background?" Sheikha Layla asked, though she wasn't sure why the question mattered. "She knows I used to travel for work, that I speak Arabic, that I care deeply about understanding different cultures. What she doesn't know is how much I gave up to be present for her childhood. And I hope she never has to know, because I hope I can build something better for her future than the survival mode existence we've been living." Marcus's voice carried absolute conviction. "Your Excellency, I am not asking for charity or sympathy. I am asking for the opportunity to prove that 8 years of deferred dreams have created someone uniquely qualified to solve the problems your American expansion faces. I know American working culture because I've lived it. I know Arab business culture because I've studied it, lived it, and never stopped loving it. I know what it means to balance competing loyalties because I've been doing it every day for almost a decade. Sheikha Layla studied his face, seeing something there that she rarely encountered in the boardrooms and business meetings that defined her world: absolute authenticity. The kind that could only be forged in the fire of real struggle and genuine sacrifice. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. "Mr. Thompson?" she said finally, her voice carrying a weight that hadn't been there at the beginning of the interview. "Your linguistic abilities are impressive. Your cultural knowledge is clearly extensive. Your personal story is compelling." Marcus felt his heart rate spike, recognizing the tone that preceded rejection. "But," she continued, and he braced himself for the inevitable dismissal, the polite explanation of why impressive wasn't enough, why compelling didn't translate to employable. Instead, Sheikha Layla Al-Rashid did something she had never done in 6 years of running her father's American operations. She stood up, walked around her desk, and sat in the chair beside Marcus, rather than across from him, a gesture that, in Arab culture, transformed their conversation from interrogation to consultation. "I want you to help me understand something," she said, her voice carrying genuine vulnerability for the first time all morning. "For 3 years, I have watched this expansion struggle. I have hired consultants, changed strategies, replaced personnel. Nothing has worked. The problems you described, they match patterns I've observed but couldn't articulate." She looked out at the Philadelphia skyline, her expression thoughtful and troubled. "I came to America believing that excellence would be recognized, that competence would overcome cultural differences, that results would speak for themselves. But every success I've achieved has been, despite American business culture, not because of it. I've been trying to impose our methods rather than finding ways to blend them." Marcus felt something shift in the conversation. No longer job interview, but genuine dialogue between two people who understood what it meant to navigate between worlds. "Your Excellency," he said softly, returning to the respectful formality of classical Arabic. "May I ask, what brought you to America for this expansion?" Sheikha Layla was quiet for a moment, her gaze still fixed on the city beyond the windows. When she spoke, her voice carried traces of the uncertainty she usually kept buried beneath layers of authority and accomplishment. "My father built his empire by understanding that the future belongs to those who can bridge divides," she said. "Oil made us wealthy, but technology, innovation, cultural exchange, these will determine who remains powerful in the coming decades. America represents the largest, most dynamic market in the world, but also the most complex culturally." She turned to face Marcus directly. "He sent me here not just to expand our business, but to learn, to become the kind of leader who could succeed in any cultural context, not just within the comfort of our own traditions." "And what have you learned?" Marcus asked gently. A small, rueful smile crossed Sheikha Layla's face. That knowing 4 languages doesn't help if you're speaking to people who think in completely different frameworks. That power without cultural fluency is just expensive isolation. She paused, her expression growing more serious. "And that perhaps the person I need to learn from isn't another consultant with theories about cross-cultural business, but someone who has actually lived the reality of bridging these worlds." Marcus felt his breath catch. This wasn't the conversation he had expected when he walked into this office, This was something else entirely. Recognition not just of his skills, but of his experience, his perspective, his unique position at the intersection of necessity and expertise. "What exactly are you asking?" he said carefully. Sheikha Layla stood up, walked back to her desk, and pulled out a thick folder marked American Operations Strategic Review. She returned to the chair beside Marcus and placed the folder between them. "I'm asking you to spend the rest of today helping me understand where we've gone wrong," she said. "Not as a job interview, but as a consultation. I want to hear your analysis of our failed partnerships, your thoughts on our current strategies, your recommendations for how to rebuild relationships we've damaged." She met his eyes directly. "I will pay you $5,000 for today's consultation, regardless of whether we move forward with employment. But more than that, I want to understand whether you and I can work together to solve problems that go far deeper than language barriers." Marcus stared at the folder, his mind racing. $5,000 was more than he made in 2 months of night shifts and weekend deliveries combined. It was enough to pay Amira's tuition, catch up on rent, maybe even fix the transmission in his car that had been grinding ominously for weeks. But more than the money, this was what he had been preparing for without knowing it, the chance to finally use everything he had learned, everything he had sacrificed to maintain, in service of the kind of work that could make a real difference. "Yes," he said simply. Sheikha Layla smiled, the first genuinely warm expression he had seen from her all morning. "Excellent. Shall we begin?" As Marcus opened the folder and began reviewing documents that represented millions of dollars in failed initiatives and missed opportunities, he realized that something fundamental had changed. He was no longer the desperate job seeker in the wrinkled suit, begging for a chance to prove himself worthy. He was a professional, an expert, a man whose unique combination of lived experience and scholarly knowledge had finally found its purpose. And for the first time in 8 years, Marcus Thompson began to believe that the story he would tell Amira that night might finally have the happy ending she deserved. The real work was just beginning. The late afternoon sun slanted through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Sheikha Layla's office, casting long shadows across the scattered documents that had consumed their attention for the past 6 hours. Marcus had removed his jacket, his sleeves rolled up, completely absorbed in the kind of analytical work he hadn't done since graduate school. Across from him, Sheikha Layla had traded her commanding executive posture for the focused intensity of someone genuinely learning. "The Patterson Industries contract," Marcus said, pointing to a thick file marked with red failure stamps. "This wasn't just about delivery delays. Look at the communication patterns in these email chains." Sheikha Layla leaned closer, following his finger as it traced through months of increasingly tense correspondence. "Every time your team asked for status updates, they responded with longer delays. Every time you offered additional support, they became more defensive. I interpreted this as incompetence," she said quietly, "or possibly dishonesty." "But look at the language they used," Marcus continued, switching to Arabic to make his point more precisely. "They kept saying they needed autonomy to execute their vision. In American business culture, micromanagement is seen as the ultimate insult. It implies you don't trust someone's professional judgment." Marcus pulled up another document on his laptop, a cultural analysis he had been working on during their consultation. "Your team's weekly check-ins, progress reports, and adjustment meetings, all of this was intended as support. But to American partners, it looked like surveillance." Sheikha Layla rubbed her temples, the weight of 3 years' worth of misunderstandings settling heavily on her shoulders. "So by trying to ensure success, we guaranteed failure." "Not guaranteed," Marcus corrected gently, "but you created a dynamic where success became much more difficult than it needed to be." The breakthrough had come around 2 p.m. when Marcus had identified a pattern that Sheikha Layla had been too close to see. Every failed American partnership had followed the same trajectory. Initial enthusiasm, growing tension around communication styles, escalating oversight from the Al-Rashid team, defensive responses from American partners, and eventual collapse amid mutual accusations of bad faith. It's like a dance, Marcus had explained, where both partners are dancing beautifully, but to completely different music. Now, as the day drew toward evening, they had identified not just the problems, but potential solutions. Marcus had outlined a framework for cultural integration that went beyond translation to address fundamental differences in business philosophy, communication styles, and relationship building. The question, Sheikha Layla said, gathering the documents into neat piles, is whether this analysis can be turned into action. Before Marcus could respond, her assistant's voice came through the intercom with unusual urgency. "Sheikha! Al-Rashid, I apologize for interrupting, but you have an urgent call from Dubai. Sheikh Mansour requests immediate consultation." "I'll call him back within the hour." He specified that the matter was urgent, ma'am. Regarding the board meeting scheduled for tomorrow, Marcus felt the temperature in the room drop several degrees. He began gathering his papers, recognizing the signs of a crisis that had nothing to do with him. "I should go." "You have important—" "Stay," Sheikha Layla said firmly, her voice carrying the authority that had built a business empire. "Please." She picked up the phone, switching to Arabic, her voice taking on the formal tones required for high-level family business. Marcus tried not to listen, but the conversation was impossible to ignore, and what he heard made his stomach tighten with concern. "Yes, uncle," Sheikha Layla said, her voice carefully controlled. "Understand the quarterly numbers are below projections." A pause, during which Marcus could hear the angry volume of the voice on the other end, though not the specific words. "The American expansion represents a long-term investment strategy. Some short-term losses are—" Another pause. Longer this time, the voice on the other end, more heated. "I disagree that the approach has been fundamentally flawed. We have identified the issues and developed solutions." This time, the interruption was sharp enough that Marcus could hear individual words: failure, responsibility, family reputation. Sheikha Layla's face had gone very still, her expression carefully neutral in the way that Marcus recognized as someone trying not to show how deeply they were being hurt. "I understand your concerns," she said finally. "I will be on a flight to Dubai tonight to address the board personally." When she hung up, the silence in the office felt heavy as lead. "I'm sorry," Marcus said quietly. That sounded difficult. Sheikha Layla remained motionless for a long moment, staring at the phone as if it were a venomous snake that had just struck. When she spoke, her voice was perfectly composed, but Marcus could hear the tension beneath it. "The board of directors has called an emergency meeting to discuss my leadership of the American expansion," she said. "They have concerns about the financial performance and strategic direction." "And by concerns, you mean they want to replace you?" She looked up at him, surprise flickering across her face at his directness. "Yes." Marcus felt something twist in his chest. Not just sympathy, but recognition. He knew what it looked like when years of careful work stood on the edge of collapse, when forces beyond your control threatened to erase everything you had built. "How long do you have?" he asked. "The meeting is tomorrow, at 3 p.m. Dubai time. My flight leaves at midnight." She glanced at her watch. 6 hours. Marcus looked at the documents scattered across the table. The analysis they had spent the day developing, the solutions that could revolutionize how the Al-Rashid Group approached cross-cultural business. 6 hours wasn't enough time to implement anything, Barely enough time to prepare a presentation. Certainly not enough time to demonstrate real results. What do you need? He asked. Sheikha Layla stood up and walked to the windows, her silhouette sharp against the Philadelphia skyline. I need a miracle, she said quietly. I need to walk into that boardroom with proof that the American expansion can work, that the investment was justified, that my leadership can produce results. What kind of proof? A major partnership agreement. A successful negotiation that demonstrates both profitability and cultural competence. She turned back to face him, her expression bleak, something I don't have and can't possibly obtain in 6 hours. Marcus was quiet for a moment, his mind racing through possibilities and probabilities. Through the networks he had maintained during 8 years of invisible work, through connections that might still matter after years of being dormant. Actually, he said slowly. You might. Sheikha Layla's eyebrows rose. Explain. Marcus pulled out his phone and scrolled through contacts he hadn't called in years. 3 years ago, I did consulting work for a logistics company called Atlantic Supply Chain. The owner, David Kim, had been trying to break into Middle Eastern markets for years, but kept hitting cultural barriers. I helped him understand why his approaches weren't working. And he spent 3 years building relationships, learning about Middle Eastern business culture, preparing for the right opportunity. Last month, he reached out to me, asked if I knew any Arab companies that might be interested in a genuine partnership rather than just a vendor relationship. Marcus looked up at Sheikha Layla. David Kim is exactly the kind of American partner. You've been looking for someone who understands that business relationships are built on trust and mutual respect, not just contracts and quarterly reports. And he has been looking for exactly the kind of partnership you want to offer. Can you arrange a meeting? I can do better than that, Marcus said, his fingers already dialing. I can arrange a negotiation. Tonight, if you're willing to trust me. Sheikha Layla studied his face, searching for signs of desperation or delusion, looking for the catch that would reveal this as another false hope. Instead, she saw something else entirely: calm confidence. The expression of someone who understood exactly what he was proposing and believed completely in his ability to deliver. What do you need from me? She asked. Your trust, Marcus said simply, and the authority to negotiate on behalf of the Al-Rashid Group. The request hung between them like a bridge across an impossible chasm. Everything about it violated standard, business protocol. You didn't hand negotiating authority to a consultant you had known for one day. You didn't build major partnerships based on personal recommendations from someone who worked night security and drove delivery trucks. But Sheikha Layla Al-Rashid hadn't built an empire by following standard protocols. She had built it by recognizing opportunity when it appeared and having the courage to act when others hesitated. Done, she said. 3 hours later, the conference room on the 42nd floor had been transformed into something unprecedented in the Al-Rashid Group's American operations. A meeting space where East and West could finally meet as equals. David Kim had arrived at 7 p.m., bringing with him his senior operations manager and a folder thick with partnership proposals he had been refining for 3 years. At 55, he carried the quiet confidence of someone who had built a successful business through competence rather than connections, substance rather than style. Marcus, he said, embracing the man who had helped save his company from cultural missteps years earlier. When you called, I almost didn't believe it. You disappear for 3 years. Then suddenly you're arranging meetings with Arab royalty? Life takes unexpected turns, Marcus replied, then shifted seamlessly into the introductions that would set the tone for everything that followed. Your Excellency, he said to Sheikha Layla in classical Arabic. May I present David Kim, founder and CEO of Atlantic Supply Chain. Mr. Kim has spent 3 years studying Arab business culture and building the kind of company that can serve as a true partner rather than just a vendor. To David, he switched to English. David, this is Her Excellency Sheikha Layla Al-Rashid, CEO of the Al-Rashid Group. She has been searching for American partners who understand that sustainable business relationships require cultural competence and mutual respect. The introduction itself was a bridge formal enough to honor Arab protocols, direct enough to satisfy American efficiency, and warm enough to suggest genuine possibility rather than mere transaction. Your Excellency, David said, his pronunciation of the title careful but respectful. Marcus helped me understand years ago that successful international partnerships require more than good contracts. They require good relationships. Mr. Kim, Sheikha Layla replied, her voice carrying the measured warmth reserved for promising first meetings, I am pleased to meet someone who has taken the time to understand our culture rather than simply trying to navigate around it. For the next 2 hours, Marcus served as more than translator. He became the bridge that allowed both sides to recognize the partnership they had been seeking. When David explained his company's approach to logistics and supply chain management, Marcus helped Sheikha Layla understand not just the technical capabilities, but the cultural values that drove the business model. When Sheikha Layla described the Al-Rashid Group's expansion strategy, Marcus helped David see not just the financial opportunity, but the cultural significance of being trusted with the company's American ambitions. The beauty of this partnership, Marcus explained at one point, switching fluidly between Arabic and English to ensure both sides understood the full implications, is that you're both solving each other's primary challenges. David needs access to Middle Eastern markets and the cultural credibility that comes from a respected Arab partner. Your Excellency needs an American partner who understands that business relationships are investments in trust, not just exchanges of services. By 9 p.m., they had outlined the framework for a partnership that would give Atlantic Supply Chain exclusive rights to handle Al-Rashid Group's American logistics operations while providing the Al-Rashid Group with the kind of culturally competent American partner they had been seeking for 3 years. This is exactly what we've been looking for, David said, reviewing the preliminary terms. A partnership where success is measured in relationships built, not just packages delivered. And this is exactly what our board has demanded, Sheikha Layla added. Proof that American partnerships can be both profitable and culturally sustainable. At 9:30, they shook hands on an agreement that would be worth $12 million in its first year, with expansion possibilities that could reach $50 million within 5 years. But more than the numbers, they had created something unprecedented in the Al-Rashid Group's American operations. A partnership built on mutual understanding rather than mutual compromise, on cultural bridge building rather than cultural accommodation. Marcus, David said as they prepared to leave, this consultation you're doing, is this your new business? Marcus looked at Sheikha Layla, uncertainty flickering across his face, for the first time all day. They hadn't discussed what would happen after tonight, whether this single consultation would lead to something more permanent, whether the success of this evening would translate into the kind of opportunity that could change his life. Mr. Thompson, Sheikha Layla said, her voice carrying the authority of someone making a decision that would reshape more than just business operations, effective immediately. You are the Director of Cultural Integration for the Al-Rashid Group's American operations. Your salary will be $180,000 annually, with performance bonuses tied to the success of partnerships like the one we've just negotiated. Marcus felt the world tilt on its axis. Your Excellency, I. Additionally, she continued. The position comes with flexible scheduling to accommodate your responsibilities as a father, comprehensive health coverage for you and your daughter, and educational benefits that will allow you to complete any advanced degrees you choose to pursue. She paused, her expression growing warmer. And because I understand that single parents face unique challenges, the company will provide an emergency childcare fund and additional support for educational expenses that exceed standard coverage. Marcus stared at her, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what she was offering, not just financial security, but recognition, respect, and the opportunity to finally use everything he had spent 8 years maintaining in obscurity. Why? He asked quietly. Because, Sheikha Layla said, you have just demonstrated something I thought was impossible. You have shown me that cultural bridges don't require anyone to abandon their values or compromise their identity. They require someone who understands both sides deeply enough to help each see the value in the other. She gathered the contracts and partnership agreements that would serve as proof of her leadership capabilities. Tomorrow, I will walk into that boardroom in Dubai with evidence that the American expansion is not only viable, but potentially the most successful international venture in our company's history. I will have that proof because of your expertise, your integrity, and your willingness to help me succeed. Marcus felt tears threatening, the emotional weight of 8 years finally finding release. Your Excellency, I don't know how to thank you. By continuing to be exactly who you are, she replied. By bringing the same dedication to this work that you brought to raising your daughter and maintaining your expertise despite every obstacle. By helping me build the kind of company that recognizes excellence wherever it appears, regardless of what packaging it comes in. At 11 p.m., Marcus called Mrs. Rodriguez to check on Amira, his voice shaking as he tried to explain that everything was about to change. Mijo, Mrs. Rodriguez said, her voice warm with joy. I knew this day would come. Amira is asleep, but she left you a note on the kitchen table. She said she had a feeling tonight was going to be special. When Marcus finally made it home at midnight, he found the note written in Amira's careful 8-year-old handwriting. Daddy, I know you had an important meeting today. I hope they saw how amazing you are. I already knew, but sometimes grown-ups are slow learners. I love you. P.S. Can we have pancakes tomorrow? The good kind with chocolate chips? Marcus sat at their small kitchen table, surrounded by the familiar constraints of their cramped apartment, and for the first time in 8 years, began to plan for a future that included dreams as well as survival. In 12 hours, he would start a job that would use everything he had learned, everything he had sacrificed to maintain, everything he had been preparing for without knowing it. In 12 hours, he would begin building bridges between worlds, helping others find the understanding and respect that had eluded him for so long. But tonight, he sat in his daughter's room and whispered the words he had been waiting 8 years to say, Tomorrow, sweetheart, everything changes, and this time it changes for the better. Across the Atlantic, Sheikha Layla Al-Rashid sat in the first-class cabin of her flight to Dubai, reviewing the partnership agreements and cultural integration proposals that would revolutionize her company's approach to international business. But more than the documents, she carried with her the memory of a man who had transformed a day of expected failure into a triumph of possibility. Not through privilege or connections, but through competence, integrity, and the kind of quiet courage that builds bridges strong enough to change the world. The crisis that had threatened to end her leadership had instead become the catalyst for its evolution, and it had happened because she had finally learned to recognize excellence not by its packaging, but by its substance. The transformation was complete. The real work was just beginning. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.